LinkedIn, LinkedIn has told me that today I am celebrating 3 years at the Calgary Zoo, 3 years at my job. I don't know if today is exactly 3 years, but I do know in general March is when I started working there, and it is now a week or so into March 2024. So that means I started here in 2021. And as I've been reminded of this, I thought maybe I would talk a little bit about my experience there over the last 3 years. Now, 3 years is really kind of a long time, but also goes by really quickly, and a lot of things change in society, personally, but also a lot of things stay the same. But one thing that's interesting is this says 3 years at the Calgary Zoo. Now, had I started working there right now, making this as my job, my employment on LinkedIn, it'd be written as the Wilder Institute Calgary Zoo. Now, this is something that has changed during my time working there. Is a rather subtle name change, or rather an additional name brought to the forefront. So, a lot of people ask me at the zoo who Wilder is and why Calgary Zoo is named after Mr. Wilder or something like this. And the truth of the matter is, Wilder is just a word. It means wilder, right? So making the world a wilder place, referencing nature, wildlife, wild places. And the Wilder Institute is a way to bring to the forefront the conservation side of what the Calgary Zoo does, which is nothing new, right? They've had long standing conservation projects and really some rather groundbreaking ones, such as the Wachow Hippo Sanctuary, which is a community conservation project. Community conservation. It's very important to highlight this word community within it. Oftentimes is the case, conservation in foreign lands from, say, North America or Europe, European countries, there's been examples of conservation done in a more colonial approach. So it's the horrible, rotten cliche of a European scientist or explorer coming into some place where there's been traditional cultures living and coexisting with nature for millennia, and you coming in there as a European scientist and saying that you know best and you're going to kick the people off their land. Okay, or you're going to tell them how to live, or you're going to build a national park and say you don't have any more human rights here, you got to leave to a different place. It's all about the animals. Now, obviously, thinking long term, how can that do well? You have to, the whole dilemma of conservation in the modern world and going forward is how humans and nature can coexist. Okay, so having conservation projects that work with communities that are already there and have a long standing history. A cool story I learned about Wachow, which is an area in northwestern Ghana, and they have a hippo population there, which is, from what I understand, there's not a lot of hippos living in those regions, right? There's kind of these different populations of hippos throughout mostly Central Africa, east or west, and then also in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. Now, there's, long-standing history of traditional people living in these regions and coexisting with hippos, but even some more recent history. And one cool story that I learned about this place and kind of is embedded within the mythology of the hippo is during the slave trading era, when all those atrocities were happening in those regions. There was a story where maybe it was on one side of the river, and I think it's the Black Volga is the river that goes through that region. Pardon me. And there's a story where some people living there that were trying to avoid, being captured or whatever the case may be, to then be be sold into the slave trade. And then they wanted to cross the river to get away, to get back to safety. And it was the hippo that raised up as they do, just emerging the little tips of their head because their nostrils, their eyes, and their ears are just above the waterline. And they go there like stepping stones for these indigenous people living there to cross the river to safety. And then when their pursuers were coming, which would have been maybe Europeans coming, then the hippos reemerged back into the water and those people were brought to safety. And that's this story that is shared within their culture there. And that's something that's very important to the people that live there. And if you want to have successful conservation initiatives, which again is all about balance between human needs and wildlife needs, then you need to honor those different stories. You need to honor the cultures and learn about how they view the wildlife because, most places naturally, they're going to have a more metaphorical connection to nature, right? It is only if you've been gone through school and studied through this scientific framework, which we kind of take for granted in the modern world. We all kind of grow up with this scientific understanding of nature that maybe we forget the metaphorical side of nature. But unless you have that scientific training, you're going to view nature through metaphor and you're going to learn about it through story. And you need to learn those metaphors and those stories that local populations have if you're going to be able to do any successful work with them. So that is one of the things that I've learned working at the zoo. Now, I will say that my role in the zoo is called visitor engagement, which you can maybe imagine what that means. Okay, it's sort of like a subset of the education department, which the education department typically works with schools and younger groups, but also really any ages and doing programs, some of them that are embedded within the curriculum and for schools coming there to learn as part of their education. But then the visitor engagement side goes out and works with all of the general public. So it's very inclusive, right? Anybody has access to this. If you come to the zoo, you could happen upon a presentation going on about gorillas, or you could, bump into someone like myself who's stationed around the tigers, and you can ask whatever questions that you have. There is someone physically there who has been trained to understand all the different ever-changing dynamics of not only the zoo, but of our understanding of nature more broadly. Okay. And then you can go there and you can ask us questions. You can talk, or you can learn through stories. So that's kind of an interesting thing to tie into the metaphor of nature and oral storytelling traditions, right? And in many ways, we're leading the charge with this when we're at the zoo. So you can imagine all of the different dynamics that can unfold throughout that. You can imagine it, but also you can't imagine it. Okay, if I go back 3 years ago now, I couldn't begin to conceptualize the different experiences that I would have at the zoo. And now let's get in some societal context to this. Maybe I'll put a bow in the community conservation thing and the Wilder Institute. So that is bringing this conservation work to the forefront. Okay, putting that in front of the name Calgary Zoo. It's the Wilder Institute Calgary Zoo. This institution does not just exist to provide animals for entertainment of viewing. Okay, this institution exists to make significant conservation change. Okay, and this is my interpretation of it. I am not someone who's been involved with the rebranding of the zoo or making any of these programs or any of the information that we learn and promote at the zoo. I am simply a microphone for these different aspects of the zoo. And I go there and I learn about all the different stories and all the different work that is done through the zoo's various different wide-ranging conservation programs. And then I go there and I amplify that message to the thousands upon tens of thousands within a month and a million or more people that come within a year. And I go and I amplify this message there. And I'm also a recipient of questions and inquiries that people have. As they're learning and hearing about what the zoo does beyond just caring for animals that are there and that they can see at the zoo, as they're learning these things and learning about the different species, they bring their questions to people like myself. There's also lots of incredible volunteers that work at the zoo and do similar roles that I do while I'm there as well. And I've learned so much from many of these volunteers that have been with the zoo for decades, literally, or maybe used to work at the zoo in different departments and now just volunteer their time. Every so often, lots of these volunteers have traveled the world, have worked at or with or volunteered at other zoos. And I just love picking their brains and hearing their stories and their perspectives on different things. So it's been such a wide ranging education in that regard. Also, all of the visitors, right? People not only will bring their zoo related questions and ideas to me, but they'll also bring their experiences and start telling me stories that they're inspired to remember by the environment that they find themselves in at the zoo. If I went back 3 years ago now, I couldn't imagine all of the different things that I would learn. And it's impossible to write this in a job description, right? All these different things. I've also been at the zoo here through a time of large scale societal change. Okay. And when you mentioned the year 2021, which is when I started there, you imagine what was going on in the world in 2021. Well, we were right in the midst of a global pandemic and all of the strangeness and confusion that ensued from that time period in our recent history. And going from that, there's been all of these other layers to society that have been unfolding as well. And one aspect that is foremost among those would be growing concern and growing awareness of environmental degradation, of changing weather patterns, of all the different concerns of the modern day. Concerns that are not new by any means, but we have the best understanding of them today, and we also have the most uh, the most multifaceted, the most dimensional issues to be concerned about. And so I think throughout the pandemic, people being required to stay indoors for long periods of time, I think this got people's minds turning in many different ways. Now, the Calgary Zoo was lucky to have been able to remain opened for a large period of time throughout the pandemic, whereas other institutions, other zoos in other parts of the world maybe were required to stay closed for much longer. I know the Toronto Zoo, for example, which is the other main zoo in Canada. I don't know if I'm biased in saying this, but I think the Calgary Zoo is number one. But I also am honest in my observations that Toronto Zoo is up there too. So, if anything, I would say Toronto Zoo, Calgary Zoo are tied at number one. But then also, Winnipeg Zoo, the Assiniboine Park Zoo, would also be up there in the ranks of number one. But none of this is a competition, of course. This is all just to say those institutions are at the same level of care and consideration for wildlife and the work that they do in conservation beyond just within the zoo, and at the same level of understanding and educational capabilities. And these are different zoos that are underneath the overarching umbrella of accreditation from the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, AZA, of which, flash forward to this fall, 2024, AZA is having their conference in Calgary. So to me, this seems like a whole thing of coming full circle. Okay, there's this big conference coming to this city, which will have people from zoos all throughout the world represented within the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and coming here to learn and to connect and inspire each other and develop these missions more and more and more. These ideas that I'm talking about are not unique to the Wilder Institute Calgary Zoo. These are shared notions of conservation and wildlife and wild places across all these different high caliber, high quality, considerate zoos throughout the world. And so I want nothing more than to continue to connect with other people that share these ideals and that are inspired to take action towards these things. Because as I was getting into, this is more and more of a concern on people's minds. And as far as I'm concerned, when you look out at these issues and you learn about them on the news or on podcasts or reading books about these different concerns, then you can't help but think, who's going to take the charge and save us? Who's going to help us get through these looming issues? Who's going to help all the biodiversity loss that's going on behind the scenes at an increasing rate? And well, I think traditionally you assume the government. Okay, you imagine these big organizations that must exist all throughout the world of scientists and conservationists that are doing the work to solve these problems. But as you get into these things, you realize that those organizations do exist, but they're more fragmented, right? And they're kind of over here and something over there and over here and over there. There's the United Nations and all the great work that they do. And then there's the conference of the parties, so as they call it, the COP, these COP meetings where it's more governmental officials going to these meetings and trying to set plans and motions. Then you have the nonprofits and the different conservation organizations like the WWF, World Wildlife Fund, or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, which, by the way, as I talk about all these organizations and explain these different things, this is all from what I've learned while working at the zoo, both from the zoo, from their internal education that they've provided me on the job, but then also, once again, from talking to others. And then the additional benefit and aspect, which has been, every day when I'm at the zoo, just surrounded by incredible species, surrounded by incredible and inquisitive people, I can't help but have my mind just reeling and reeling with these things to the point where I get home and I go to my library and I go to my bookshelf and think, what books can I read that are going to continue my education? Or what's this thing that I need to research? And I'm going home and I'm listening to a podcast on it, or I'm just doing some deep diving research. So this has really permeated my being. And I've also begun writing over the last 3 years, and I have 3 book projects on the go, which you may have heard me talk about. And one of those book projects is very much relating to what I have now understood as human ecology, which I get into in other podcasts and other things that I've talked about and written about. So I won't get into that here, but I will say that being at the zoo has been the greatest breeding ground for my understanding of human ecology. And I'm going to continue this into the future. I now know that the number one place in all of the entire world to understand and study human ecology is a zoo. There's many factors behind that, but zoos are often going to be biodiversity hotspots within urban landscapes. So what do I mean by that? Well, a biodiversity hotspot is a place that has lots of biodiversity. So many different species, from plants to fungi to animals, and all concentrated within one locale. So you can think about maybe in Canada, the boreal forest region would be somewhat of a biodiversity hot spot, although it kind of is lacking in species diversity compared to places like rainforests. So in Canada, really what comes to my mind is the Great Bear rainforests, or the northwestern part of North America, and all along the west coast, really. But then you think of somewhere like the Amazon rainforest, which is the number one most biodiverse place in the world. And number two would be the rainforests of Southeast Asia, so Indonesia or Malaysia and the islands of Borneo and those places. And these are also landscapes that I've learned about while being at the zoo. Zoos are also a place where you can travel the world in one place. That makes sense. So you go to the African rainforest building at the Calgary Zoo, and now you can close your eyes, listen to the sounds, smell the smells, open your eyes, look at all the plants living, go and spend time with Western lowland gorillas, with Eastern black and white colobus monkeys, with all of these species, and go through the aviary, which has several different bird species free flying. And you can imagine what it's like in those regions. You can even suspend disbelief and say that you are in that region currently. And so that's what I mean by zoos are biodiversity hotspots. They provide a mixture of all these different species that are naturally only found in completely different places all around the globe. And kind of magically, here they are, all together within this locale, within the walls of the zoo, so to speak. And so I've often thought about this from a human ecological perspective, but also from an alien perspective. Okay, if you were able to get rid of human subjectivity and just look at the world objectively, kids are really good at this. They'll be in the penguin building, for example, and you might ask them, where do you think penguins live in the world? This is another thing I've learned very well at the zoo, and they've done tremendous training to anyone in any of these public facing roles in the zoo, is training you how to really prompt people, how to get other people to think instead of just spewing out information. Here's all the facts, you better listen. You want to share information in a story. People learn better by hearing stories, teaching them about individuals within the zoo, not just broadly about the species, but the individual animal, but then also prompting and asking questions to the visitors, whether they're adults or little children. You want to prompt them and try to get the wheels turning. What do you think this animal is doing? Where do you think this animal lives in the world? So, where do you think penguins live? And they might say, quite cleverly, oh, they live at the Calgary Zoo. They live in Calgary. They live right here, obviously. And of course, you dismiss that and say, well, no, this is just the zoo. They don't live here. They only live in the southern hemisphere, or this species lives around Antarctica, in the subantarctic islands. Of course, that's true, but it's also like, you're not wrong. This penguin does live here, and there's a self sustaining population of penguins that does live here. And then, more broadly, distributed across zoos all throughout the world is multiple populations of penguins. And those penguins might move to another zoo for genetic diversity purposes. Something else I've learned working at the zoo is all the work that goes behind the scenes for maintaining robust populations of animals. So I think naively, you might you might look at a zoo and think like, oh yeah, they just have tigers there, and those tigers will have cubs, and it's a self-sustaining population, and the tigers just always reproduce there, but they only live at this zoo. And it's like, well, no, of course not. You'll run into genetic issues. Okay, we understand vaguely the notion of inbreeding and how that can lead to concerns, but then we have to assume that zoos are going to have a strategy to avoid that. And then also underlying all of this is not just a tiger being there for entertainment purposes, it's a tiger being there to safeguard its species against extinction. I would say one of the darker things that I've realized or learned delving into all of these things is just truly the plight that many species face. If you take tigers, for example, and this is talking about all tiger subspecies, okay? There was around 100,000 at the beginning of the 1900s. Today, 2024, I don't know the exact status of them today, but there's something around 4,000, I believe, or that number could be 6,000. I do believe at the beginning of the 2000s, it was down to just 2,000 tigers worldwide. Now, today, the most populous tiger subspecies is the Bengal tiger, which is in India. But then the Amur tiger, which has also been known as the Siberian tiger, but as their range shrunk, they're now only found around the Amur River region, which actually separates Russia and China, the Amur River. So the Amur tiger, I believe, is anywhere from 400 to 600 living today. And I also learned this. That's about the same amount as there is distributed throughout zoos around the world. Now, here's another key distinction that I've learned being on the inside of a zoo is there's a important line between a zoo, a high quality, well, I don't know. I don't have to say a high quality zoo because I've learned that in order to call something a zoo, it has to be high quality. It has to be scientifically focused. Okay, if you have animals just on display for entertainment purposes and there's no consideration of conservation, you're not a zoo. You're something different. You're something totally different. And of course, we could get into this, the perception of zoos as a good or bad thing. And I have lots and lots of thoughts and ideas on that, which I will continue to get into in my writings mainly, but also through the podcast and videos that I make. There is an important distinction to make. And I think moves like what the Calgary Zoo has done to incorporate the Wilder Institute and to get people to understand the conservation side of it, that is important. But just the term zoo is problematic, let's say, because of the history and also the ongoing issue with how some people care for animals. And so, if we're talking about tigers, we can think about Tiger King, which I don't know when that was released, but it was definitely in vogue around during the pandemic time. I think this was like a great show that people loved to binge watch when they were stuck at home and had nothing better to do. Now, Tiger King depicts this really horrible aspect of keeping tigers under the care of humans and really just for kind of these grandiose entertainment sort of things. There's not a lot of science that goes into how they care for these animals. But also, I will say, like, I think it reflects a more broad kind of human concern. And I think the people involved in that Tiger King scenario were very mentally unwell and had a lot of personal human issues going on too. And these tigers are sort of stuck in the mix of these contrasting human things, human dynamics going on. There's a common phrase or statement that goes around that mentions how there is as many tigers living in Texas as there is living around the world. Okay. And that's, again, I think anywhere, this is a big gap, but somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000. Okay, give or take a couple thousand, I know, but still, it's somewhere in that range, and that is true. Now, again, it is also true that there's the same amount of Amur tigers living in zoos as there is in the wild. But again, there's a key difference of Amur tigers living in zoos. They know the genetic history of these tigers. They know that they are from the Amur tiger subspecies. When you're a tiger living in the Tiger King situation, you don't know if that's an Amur tiger or if it's a Bengal tiger, and likely it's a mix between them. And likely now there's constant inbreeding, so then they're almost becoming something totally different in and of themselves. And they're losing those wild instincts because they're handled by humans maybe as cubs, or they're just in all of these unnatural situations. And that's something as well that the philosophy of a good quality zoo in the modern world should be one of keeping the animals' wild instincts as intact as possible. So there's so many dynamics that I've learned about how the animal care team puts into effect to allow these animals under their care to maintain their natural instincts as much as possible. So there's such an in-depth understanding of each different species. What does the polar bear need to be cared for properly? What does the tiger need to be cared for properly? Because a lot of these species, such as the critically endangered Amur tiger, as they live distributed across zoos around the world, tigers going to different zoos, right? I've seen 3 different males at the Calgary Zoo during my 3 years there, and they will move to a different zoo, and then a different tiger will come here from a different zoo. And they're trying to maintain genetic diversity. What tiger is best matched with this tiger? Does this tiger have, 2 generations back, it's from the wild? Oh, those genetics are valuable. We need to have those represented. So let's see if we can get these tigers together to reproduce. Let's see, because you also can't force that. But you can provide a good situation. So if the tigers are happy and healthy, happy maybe aside, I've learned as well that you cannot anthropomorphize animals. You cannot just look at them and say, oh, that tiger is happy or that tiger is really sad. You don't know. You can't project human emotions on species, but you can get a sense, of course, for if they are healthy. And one of those senses is if they will reproduce. That's a very good sign that they're living in healthy situations conducive to who they are as a species if they're able to reproduce. Okay, they wouldn't do that if they lived in cages and lived in, unnatural settings, which animals have throughout the history of zoos back in the old days when we didn't understand. And unfortunately, animals still do today in a number of these weird entertainment facilities that exist all around the world. Okay, so That's one big aspect. But then let's finish off with going back to what that clever little kid might say with where penguins live in the world. So, animals, well, as we go into the future, and if you just had an objective perspective of humans and nature, you would have to say that penguins live in the southern hemisphere, but then they also live in these little subpopulations, oftentimes in urban centers, which is where zoos are often located, right in the middle of the city, as it is with Calgary Zoo, at least on the suburbs and around and close to these city centers. So all around the world, you have these biodiversity hotspots, almost like a Noah's Ark, to think metaphorically about it. And you have species from around the world living within zoos, which are kind of like a contained ecosystem in and of themselves. And you couldn't help but notice that the animals that live there live in a sort of symbiosis with the humans that care for them. And so that is animals under human care. Now, how do you conceptualize that? Are those subpopulations of animals? Are those, as we go forward into the future, flash forward 2, 3, 400 years, do those then become different subspecies? So these are more philosophical questions, and a view that summarizes the work that I'm doing with my human ecology sort of writing and with the ideas I'm proposing in my podcast. But fundamentally, these have been ideas that have been given birth to in my mind by spending time at the zoo. And so maybe that is all to say that being able to work at the zoo for the last 3 years has been the greatest opportunity that I've had for education. Far better, I would say, than going to university, even. Nothing to knock that, but, well, I also know that after working this long at the zoo, if I was to go to university, I know exactly what I'm going to be studying. Anything relating to ecology, zoology, or biology. How fascinating this is. I didn't understand that out of high school. I didn't understand that, you know, studying ecology in university was going to be so interesting and that it could lead to fantastic job opportunities. Our society, where I live at least, has done a really poor job of impressing upon young people that ecology is where it's at. If you want to make a real impact in this world, and if you want to get into a field that is always dynamic and always changing and there's never enough that you can learn, then ecology, biology, zoology, and conservation, this is the field to go into. So I hope more and more to impress upon, especially younger people, that you should pursue these things going forward. But I also want to impress on people that you don't need to pursue them just through university. You can get involved with an organization like a zoo, whether you volunteer or luck out and get a job with them, which is what I did. I totally lucked out and I'm forever grateful for this. Or just going to the zoo and studying all the information that is provided through the zoo, talking to people that are there at the zoo, such as myself, that can promote this message and can be a collaborator in your educational process. You don't need to go to university. There's so much online that you can learn as well. But one thing is for sure, for everybody, whether you want to create your career within this field or not, the more we learn and understand ecology, the more we learn and understand human ecology, the better off we're going to be collectively. And I think that is the way forward and the way out of these concerns and crises that we have going on around the globe, as it pertains to human nature. And that is to say, humans and nature, of which we are 100% a part of. So those are some of the ideas I've been working through, and I've been grateful to learn about being able to be involved in such a wonderful organization as the Wilder Institute Calgary Zoo is. And those are my reminiscence of my 3-year anniversary. And here's to many more years and hopefully decades of research and in-depth experience within these fields. So thank you for watching or listening, and go and visit a zoo near you and continue your education as a human ecologist, which we all are. So thank you and goodbye. Yeah, no. Yeah, very nice. Okay, goodbye, everyone. Gonna go outside. It's a beautiful spring-ish day here in early March.